Good morning, everyone. I'm Reverend Kathy Howell, and I'm the chaplain here at the Hermitage. I'm still working from home, and I know all of you are still in your apartments, except for the time you go to exercise and walk. But still, we're all doing what we can. One thing that helps make this time a little bit easier is having friends and family and people you can talk to. Of course, the primary way I talk to my friends and family is on the phone, and that's a wonderful thing. But friends are real important too, and I try to keep up with my friends on a regular basis. I have a story about friendship I'd like to share with you today. It's one of those stories that's been passed down in my family. I remember first hearing this story from my grandfather, and actually the person the story's about is his father. His father's my great-grandfather's name was Charles Dexter Grant. Dexter is a name that is very common in my family. As a matter of fact, my brother Dexter, well, no, not my brother Dexter, my nephew, James Dexter, is, I believe, the 6th generation of the oldest son having the middle name of Dexter. That's just something that's been passed on in my family. Well, this is a story. What happened, the story I'm going to tell you today is actually one that's well known in my family. And Charles Dexter, that was my great-grandfather, he was 33 years old. They lived in upstate New York, in a town called Redfield. It's actually it's north of, it's just east of Lake Erie and north of Buffalo. It's about at the same level with Watertown, but it's a little further east than Watertown, maybe about 20 miles or so, and it's up another 600 feet in elevation. It's on what they call the Tug Hill Plateau. And if you've ever heard that name, it's probably because you're either from the area or you've heard it on the news as one of the places that gets some of the heaviest snowfall in the continental United States. Very often the snowfalls are more than 300 inches in a single winter. Well, in 1903, my great-grandfather, C.D., was 33 years old. And like so many men back in Redfield in that day, because the farming season, he was a farmer, but the farming season's pretty short. So, the growing season. My dad used to say that up in Redfield you had 3 seasons. You had June, July, and winter. Because summertime was real short. But they would get a good growing season, and that was enough. But it is long winters with heavy snowfall. So like so many of the men up there, they worked in logging industry back then at the turn of the 20th century, the early years of the 20th century. And my great-grandfather C.D. was no different. So he was out, and they'd spend the winters out at the logging camps. Well, C.D. was out at a logging camp, and he'd written to his wife and family that he wasn't going to be able to make it home for Christmas. But 2 days before Christmas, he and his friend Tom Donnellan, Tom was also a man from Redfield, they got to talking about it, and they decided that they would go ahead and they'd go home for Christmas. And they'd go home after all. Now, the night before, there'd been a very heavy snowfall. And so the snow was deep. And though the trail between the logging camp and Redfield was clearly marked with blazes on the trees. It's where they mark the trees with either cut down on the tree or they paint the tree. I think, though, now we paint trees, but in those days I think they just used to cut a notch on the tree to blaze the trail. And they had but the blaze marks were covered, and you had to dig down to find the blaze marks. Well, earlier in that morning, C.D. had directed, there were 2 men also looking to head to Redfield, and they'd started out a few hours before. C.D. had shown them the trail to Redfield. So once Tom and C.D. decided they were going to go home for Christmas, they started off. And they followed the footsteps of the men who had gone off and headed on the trail to Redfield earlier that morning. And after a while though, they realized the trail didn't look right. So they started to dig down and look for blazes on the trees, but they didn't find any. And they realized that these men had gotten off the trail. Well, it turned out the other two men ended up back at the logging camp and got there safely. But CD and Tom, they thought they had figured out what they'd done wrong, and they were looking for the blazes on the trees, and before you know it, they couldn't find them. Well, they never found them, and they were off the trail, and they were lost. It took them a while to realize that, but they just couldn't find the tree. They'd expected the walk to Redfield to take them about half a day, so they hadn't brought any real supplies with them. Now it was getting dark. It was December, just before Christmas, and they had no food, they had no fire, they were cold, and no one knew that they were missing. The people at the logging camp wouldn't look for them. They figured they told everyone they were going to Redfield. The people in Redfield didn't know they were coming, so they wouldn't have known they were missing. To make matters worse, as they crossed the stream, CD broke through the ice and got his feet wet. Now, wet feet are dangerous when you're out there in the snow because you can get frostbite. Well, the two men kept struggling on. They stopped and rested, but they didn't want to sleep, because if you lay down and go to sleep in the snow, you'll freeze to death and never wake up. So they kept pressing forward. But exhaustion wore on them eventually. And they finally decided, after more than a day of trying to find their way home out of the woods, they were just too exhausted to go on without some rest. So what they did was, one man would lie down in the snow in a clearing and sleep. The other man would walk about 10 paces away and make a big circle and walk around that big circle several times. And then when he was finished with it, a certain number of times, then when he was finished with it, he'd go wake up the man who was sleeping in the snow, and they'd change places. And the other man would keep track of time by walking around by walking the circle. And then they'd switch off like this in each way that each man could get a little bit of rest. Well, the thing is at some point, one of the men decided they didn't want to get up. They decided that they'd just give up, lay in the snow and freeze to death. Well, they were good friends, see? So the other man went and found a big stick, starts beating him with it, till he made the man who was laying in the snow so mad that he got up out of the snow. And they kept walking. On the third day, they came out of the woods. They staggered out of the woods about 1.5 miles from CD's house. The neighbor looked out of his window when he saw two men staggering toward him, walking slowly, falling, getting back up, and they thought they were drunk. So the woman called her husband, and she said, "Look at these two drunk fools." But then the more they watched, the more they decided, those men aren't drunk, those men are in trouble. So they helped Tom and CD inside the house. They began warming them up, and they sent for their families. Now CD's wife had already been on edge. The reason being is because CD's dog had been acting funny the last the last couple of days. He'd been on the back porch, standing there, looking out toward the logging, in the direction of the logging camp. No matter what they did, they couldn't get him to stop. It's where he would keep going back, and he'd whimper and whine. So she had a feeling, she said that something was wrong. And when she heard that CD had been lost in the woods for 3 days and was found but was frostbit, she was worried. Well, fortunately both Tom and CD survived the ordeal. But unfortunately, the toes on both feet had been severely frostbitten for CD. And he lost all the toes on both feet. Which it took him a while. You need your big toe your big toe is really instrumental in helping you keep balance. But he'd lost all his toes, so it took him a while to learn to walk again. But he did fine, and he lived to a ripe old age. He worked the farm, preferred to work with a team instead of a tractor. He always liked horses better than tractors. And he always plowed with a team and kept a team of horses. And he did that pretty much until he died in 1957. So you see, those two men were really good friends. Because the funny part of the story is that they would talk about the fact that one man had taken a stick and beat the other to keep him from freezing to death in the snow. Never till their dying day did they admit which man fell asleep in the snow and which man was the one who beat him with the stick. They took that story to their grave. Now that's true friendship. They were there for each other. They encouraged one another. They even were willing to take a stick to them if it was what was necessary out of friendship. And then they kept secret the embarrassment for the rest of their lives. That was good friendship. Very good friends. I really want to tell you how much I appreciate being able to share these things with you. I hope you are enjoying these little talks. I have lots of stories about my family. My family were great storytellers. And it was always something I enjoyed. Listening to my grandfather, my father, my mother. But all of us have our stories. I'm sure you've got lots of stories from your childhood and your family. Stories that have been passed down, stories that are about you and you've passed down. It's important to pass those things on, because future generations can learn important lessons about life. They can learn about the caliber of the people that they come from, about their strength and their integrity, about their mistakes so they can avoid them, about their humor so they can laugh. But all of that helps keep us grounded in our own identity. So pass on the stories you know. Heck, share them with me. Who knows? I might use them on here. It's always good to talk. I hope to spend some time with you soon. Bye. God bless.